Chapter 19. Rage in their veins, fear in their eyes.
It was still raining, even though the storm's fury seemed to have subsided. It was as if nature itself was exhausted by the effort required. Although the rain was not as heavy as before, there was no telling how long it would last. The eye of the storm had passed just above them, but the rolling thunder warned that there was still plenty of water to fall. It was well into the night. The impenetrable realm of Kala was broken only by the pulsing orange light of the campfire burning on the slabs of strange green stone. Garin stood nearby, warming a dark broth in a dented metal pot over the fire. He shivered at his post, staring at the three young friends who were huddled together against the cold. He looked out towards the exterior, black as a demon's soul, and punished by the rain. Gusts of wind blew cold, damp air through the open sides of the veranda. It was laden with the thick smell of wet earth and carried with it some of the crystalline beads that had fallen from the sky. It had been a wise decision to stop there, despite the damp conditions. Garin sniffed one of the wooden bowls in which he had served the hot broth to the youths. A distinctive pungent smell flooded his olfactory pathways. He smiled ruefully, hoping he had not overdone it with the landhall powder. The wood of this peculiar steppe tree, ground and mixed with hot liquid, were well known for its somniferous effects. Equally famous is the characteristic scent of the sap when it dries. He had added a little of it to their drinks to help them sleep and keep at bay the nightmares that often visited them. Without its help, they would hardly have been able to close their eyes from anxiety and fear. There could be mild side effects, but it was a sacrifice worth making. At worst, they would wake up the next morning with a bit of a hangover, as if they had drunk too much. But the deep sleep granted to them would bring some respite from the great burden they were carrying. He set the bowls on the ground by his side and looked back at the sleepers. Alwen had disappeared as usual. It mattered little to him that all the water in the world seemed to be falling on their heads. He had wandered off into the vast maze of corridors, courtyards and halls that filled this ruined palace and its legendary city. At any moment, he would emerge from one of the dark corners like a phantom. Damned comparison. That night, Alwen's absence was especially hard on him. Every whisper, every sound in the night made his nerves twitch. It could be his companion returning from the shadows, or it could be 100 alternatives he preferred not to think about. Garin was prepared to stay up all night. It wouldn't be the first time. The hours passed slowly. Garin's deft hands worked the wood with his small tools, cutting here and there to free the form trapped within. Perhaps it was the only way to pass the tedium of the night without falling into the crushing apathy that boredom brings, or the madness of paranoia. Soon his ears picked up a sound slowly approaching from one of his flanks. His head turned quickly and he reached for the bow and arrows that lay within arm's reach. He didn't need to. A familiar voice calmed him.
"Do not be alarmed. It is me,"
whispered a calm and assured voice. The figure of his enigmatic companion emerged from the shadows. Garin returned to his relaxed position without asking any questions. He knew exactly what his friend had been doing. He was only surprised that he had returned so late.
"Some broth?"
he asked his friend, offering him his half-empty bowl.
"Yes, thank you."
Alwen accepted the hot broth, taking the first sips while still on his feet. The soothing effects of the bland soup did not last long, and the half-breed eventually sat down by the fire, facing his companion. Alwen's eyes held no secrets from the half-elf with whom he had shared a life on the road. There was such a complicity between them that to try to hide it would only delay and hinder the inevitable. As the two elves looked at each other, Alwyn knew that he would end up answering questions not yet asked.
Is something wrong, friend?
Asked Garin.
You should lie down. It's been a rough day.
The attempt to evade the question was clear.
Get some rest. I'll continue the watch.
What is going on, Alwyn?
It was quicker to confess than to be badgered by the insistent elf.
We are not alone in this place.
Garin betrayed his nervousness by instinctively moving his hand to his bow and peering wistfully into every dark corner. His friend's hand came to rest on his, and the gesture seemed to calm him.
If something wanted to attack, it would have done so when I was alone, but it worries me. Tomorrow I will enter the underground of the city. I followed a shadow there.
Are you mad, Alwyn? Let us leave this place as soon as possible.
We will, but I want to be sure that everything is in order.
The half-breed averted his eyes from the group of humans.
Looks like they have managed to sleep after all.
Garin smiled wryly.
Well, they've drunk enough landhowl to knock out an ox.
The archer looked at the three humans sleeping on the hard surface that served as their beds. He keenly felt the anguish that afflicted their souls. He waited for his companion to take his next sip of broth before asking about their fate.
What do we do with them, Alwyn?
His friend sipped his broth, slowly looking down at his bowl without answering.
We must think of something. Where are we going to take them? How long are we going to keep this situation going, friend?
I wanted to get rid of them at the first opportunity.
The half-dwarf replied, pulling the bowl away from his mouth.
But you didn't.
Garin reminded him, with a serious tone of voice.
And don't think I don't know why you couldn't refuse. Now they're coming with us. But where?
I don't know.
Garin looked back at the group of sleepers for a moment before continuing.
We've already taken our first casualties. They are shattered. Do we wait for them to fall one by one? We must make a decision.
I gave them my word, Garin. I told them I would help them, but I don't know how. If their survival is not guaranteed in our company, imagine them running around alone. The first squadron that sees them will kill them or put them in a cage they'll never get out of. I'd like to think we're prolonging their lives.
Sooner or later, what happened today will happen again, and we'll lose more. We should come up with something concrete.
Alwyn sat in silence for a moment, deep in thought.
Something will happen. I am sure of it. As my father used to say, if the wind brings trouble, the wind will carry it away.
Yelm was already rising above the treetops when Claudia awoke. Little Red Minos had not quite managed to shake off the embrace of the horizon. No one was there. The skins and various camp utensils lying around the smoldering campfire indicated that they had not left without her. But the place looked deserted. She looked up at the blue sky above the interior of the city. The rays of light from the sun shone upon the greenish ruins as if it were a summer morning. The brightness was so intense that the girl had to squint. She lifted her hand to shield her face from the glaring light falling directly on her face. This ruinous green interior, with levels of terraces rising into the blue sky, still resisted the weight of time with dignity and defiance. Those who walked through its corridors, halls, and courtyards felt the haunting presence of silence and oblivion. One could lose herself in this place. But it also invited one's melancholic thoughts and memories to surface and merge with the terrible solitude of this place, stripped of its history and culture. Nothing moved in this desolate place, flooded by the pleasant rays of the sun, so welcome after the storm of the previous day. Claudia decided to walk a little to clear the cobwebs in her mind. She had slept well, and felt rested. Everything would be perfect if it weren't for the dull pounding in her head. She left the shelter of the porticos and began to move through the deserted streets of this unique city. She hoped to find someone. Despite the numbness of her senses, she could not get Dickie's last forlorn look out of her mind. She recalled with anguish their last conversation, those last few seconds that had passed so quickly. Her mind still struggled to accept they had really happened. Then his last moments came back to her mind. That vicious sword striking that cruel, fatal blow, and that defeated body falling to the planks of the bridge, never to rise again. She had seen him die, in front of her eyes. She still couldn't believe it. The incident on the bridge had made her understand that all this had little or nothing to do with fiction. That fiction so typical of a movie, in which bullets may graze the protagonist but never really hurt him. This was not a film, nor were they protected by the luck of the protagonist. It brought them back to a harsh and cruel reality, as close as the one they had experienced in their own lives, even if they had always felt far away from guns, danger, and real death. Then, just as a cold shower awakens one from a deep sleep, the delusional state of mind that made her believe they were living on some sort of theatrical stage suddenly dissipated and disappeared. The same landscapes and their evocative mysteries that had once fascinated her now bore down upon her with overbearing force. That first bitter feeling of helplessness, which had been deceptively diluted by the recent journey in the company of the elves, now returned with all its intensity. She felt that this world did not belong to her, and the need to leave as soon as possible came back with a vengeance. Facing death does have one virtue, making a pragmatist and realist out of even the most romantic of souls. They had lost 2 companions in one day. Who would be the next to fall? This bloodthirsty, hostile world was no dream. Every night when she closed her eyes, she wished with all her might that when she opened them again, none of this had happened. If only her life would return to the monotonous routine she missed so much now. Alwen kept thinking that there was something strange about these ruins, and he refused to give up his search. He thought that these relics of the legendary past held some secret that they did not want to reveal, or that his keen senses were incapable of discovering. This made the Mostal elf nervous, but he preferred not to discuss the matter with Garin, who had already made it clear that he was very superstitious about the legends and myths that surrounded the forest. Alwen moved cautiously down into the depths of the city. A tiny cloud of dust rose from the stone and quickly dissipated. The dust seemed to be the only thing alive here. Then the descent into the interior began. The half-breed was certain that he was the first creature in thousands of years to set foot on these steps. His eyes were about to behold a scene that had been forbidden to the world for centuries. It did not amuse him at all. He did not need to carry a light. His pupils could do without it, and Alwen was more attracted to the idea of wielding his sword with both hands than wasting his right hand holding a lantern. Maybe it was not such a good idea to go down alone, but he did not trust his companion to keep his cool down there. Step by step, the warrior moved away from the light outside. The rays of the 2 suns shining through the opening grew dimmer with each step, fading to a mere memory. The ceiling towered 8 feet above his head, and the width allowed at least 4 people to stand side by side in the tunnel. In front of him, a huge thick archway of interlacing floral keystones greeted the elf, a short distance from where the stairs ended. The interior was dank. A thick, musty smell betrayed centuries of neglect, The stone was identical to the one that made up the buildings and walls outside. It seemed to form the serpentine roots of the city itself, stretching down in a network of multiple branches. The relief of a blind arcade, adorned with arboreal shapes, decorated the full length of the walls with their fine and exquisite filigree. It rested flawlessly on engaged columns, very similar to those that could be seen outside, presenting stylish depictions of sylvan settings and images. Many of these columns still had the metal frames that had once supported torches, which were made to look like tree shoots, roots, or other such arboreal elements to achieve the same scenic effect. The high vaulted roofs were covered with the same false vegetation carved into the rock. Some of the lamps and lanterns that had once illuminated these dark and barren corners still adorned the walls. Now there was nothing to be heard but silence. Yet the metallic echo of armor still seemed to resonate through the subterranean chambers of this ghostly city. Wondrous has always been the hand of the elves, capable of infusing color and richness even into subterranean walls and secret passageways which were rarely frequented. What an admirable devotion to beauty this race had. However, the warrior's face twisted into a grimace as his eyes wandered over the decorations on the walls. In that moment, as his senses were saturated by the refined elegance of the elves, he felt irritated by that half of his blood, which bound him to such sublime artistry. Alwen shook his head in disdain. This was a people so obsessed with beauty, he thought to himself, that they would waste time and effort decorating an inert stone wall, yet banished and starved their veterans disfigured by war. He could not forgive the elves for producing such sublime art while ruthlessly stripping their young half-breeds of all identity and past. Alwen decided to explore the corridors and rooms closest to the main tunnel. With this in mind, he began his advance. Now he entered this forgotten tomb. He broke the peace and silence of the place that had been undisturbed for millennia. It was enough to make him hesitate for a moment. Soon he reached a room that must have served as some sort of storeroom, even if the decorations on the walls were still as rich and exquisite as ever. Several vessels of refined glass, now empty, still stood in the hollows and on the dusty shelves that lined one wall. A huge mosaic adorned the floor, depicting the symbols of Voria, goddess of drink and feasting, the Kythros, and the Ambra. It was clearly a wine cellar. Alwen's attention was drawn to some pieces of metal lying forgotten on the dusty floor of the room. He approached them and knelt down to examine them more comfortably. There was no light where he was, but his eyes did not need it to distinguish their shapes and forms. Everything in his field of vision was tinted with a dull range of grays that confused, dilated, and obscured outlines and silhouettes. He picked up a few curved plates of shattered metal and examined them. It took him a while to recognize them as useless fragments of armor. To one side, somewhat hidden, lay the helmet. It was a simple sallet helm with no ornamentation other than the piston ring where the crest's thick mane of hair had once stood. The steel had buckled from a terrible blow to the temporal side of the skull, causing a large dent that had warped the metal. Alwen held the helmet in both hands and stared into its hollow eye slits, wondering who its unfortunate owner might be. What eyes had looked through those empty dead cavities thousands of years ago? And a deep respect filled his soul. Suddenly there was a rumble that ran through the silent tunnels like the sound of rolling thunder. It was a loud groan, as if somewhere underground a wall had shifted and then moved back into place with a crash. An uncomfortable feeling came over Alwen. He felt a tingling in his spine, warning him of movement in these abandoned corridors. The piece of ancient metal slipped from his hand and hit the ground with a loud clatter. Alwen sprung to his feet and pressed his back against the nearest wall. Then he drew the sword with a woman's name from its sheath. He remained as still and silent as if part of the stone surface. No, there was no one else in the room. His eyes told him so, as did the ability to sense vibrations in stone inherited from his dwarven blood. There was nothing in the adjoining corridors either. He was sure of that. He slowly made his way to the archway that would lead him back to the corridor from which he had entered the room. He poked his head out, all his senses alert. Maybe it was Garin, he thought for a moment. The rumbling sound resonated down the corridor again, disturbing the silence of this supposedly deserted place. This time it sounded more distant, coming from further underground. Alwen was able to identify the direction. Part of him wanted to turn back, find his companions, and leave this cursed city. The other, more powerful part, urged him to seek out the source of the sound. With a firm and determined step, the half-dwarf began to walk along the shadowy corridors, his sword brandished before him. Soon he could sense that the sound was rhythmic and that it occurred at equal intervals. What was puzzling was that it did not always seem to come from the same place. A fear crept into his mind.
Someone is trying to lead me somewhere,
he thought to himself.
Or to confuse me.
Alwen paused and sank one knee onto the ground. He placed his bare hand on the large slabs of the floor. The green stone spoke to him at once. He lifted his eyes and warily looked around in all directions. It could not be Garin, unless he had developed the ability to split and duplicate himself. His stone sense might not be as accurate and efficient as that of a pure dwarf, but he was sure that more than one individual shared the dark tunnels with him. He struggled to make sense of the vibrations coming through the rock. They were moving, and they moved organically, as if through the rock itself. As soon as he lost track of them, they would reappear somewhere else. This made it almost impossible to know their exact number or position. They were scattered, and the sporadic nature of their movements was disconcerting. Without hesitation, Alwen began to move forward into the network of tunnels ahead. At last, he saw a light at the end of the corridor. It was a dim, monotonous light, with a soft glass-like hue. On reaching it, the half-dwarf slowed his pace and approached with caution. The corridor wound like a black snake through the earth. It opened into a very large, square room. The ornate roofing rose at least a dozen paces in curved, intricate lines until they were almost out of sight. Light came from the very top of the vaulted ceiling, where the stone rose several feet further above the ground. Transparent slabs filtered the light from outside, acting as a sieve. Columns of clear greenish-blue light cascaded into the room, dispersing the shadows and evoking a soothing ambience that seemed both mythical and spiritual in nature. It was like the aura emanating from the stained glass windows of the great cathedrals. 4 huge columns with sinuous forms and lavish carvings enclosed what had once been a small pond, now empty of water. In it, the figures of a male and female elf were intertwined so closely that they almost merged into a single body. The female was the most damaged of the two. She had lost her head and both arms. Alwen did not know what they represented. They stood in each other's arms, forming an intricate spiral. Perhaps it meant something to the Sherik. The half-breed circled the remains of the curious couple of illuminated stone. Suddenly, the noise made the warrior's hair stand on end again. Hastily, he raised his sword. The aerial danced between his fingers before being firmly grasped within his 2 hands. Alwen's eyes turned away from the dry fountain and scanned the shadows. The chamber had 4 entrances, which probably used to be secured by huge gates, 1 in each wall. Behind him was the mouth of the tunnel he had entered. In front of him, the corridor continued into the bowels of the earth. There were 2 additional exits on the lateral sides of the room. The sound had undoubtedly come from one of them. Alwen sensed that this place was far from safe, but he was determined to discover the source of the disturbance. The clicking sound came again. It was an unpleasant sound, a brief, metallic noise that was projected by the silence and echoed through the hollow rooms. It had nothing to do with the thunderous roar that had brought him there. It sounded like metal scraping against metal, much like the clanking of armor plates against each other. The sound began to intensify, to multiply. Alwen gripped his sword tightly, and a cold sweat began to break out on his forehead. He had the unmistakable feeling that, as had occurred so often before, the further enjoyment of life would depend on the edge of his sword and his dexterity. Soon, the sound became clear. Alwen craned his neck towards the tunnel that stretched before him, certain that something was approaching from within. His eyes sank into the darkness that spread beyond his vision. The sound stopped.
Enough! Come out at once!
He shouted resolutely into the darkness, and the warrior's deep, sonorous voice rolled like thunder through the empty tunnels.
Talk or fight, but do it face to face.
The echo repeated the half-dwarf's words, drifting into the distance down the corridors. Then it fell silent. Nothing happened in the seconds that followed. All that Alwen could hear was his own breathing. Everything was still, quiet, as if no one had ever descended here, into the ancient ashes of history, ever. His attuned ears heard the sound of armor plates clanking together, as if in a belated answer to his challenge, not only from the tunnel that opened in front of him, but also from the side corridors. It unsettled the warrior. Soon he could make out the first silhouettes, moving through the shadows at a steady pace. A metallic chime accompanied them like a monotonous, discordant melody, as the silhouettes left the veil of darkness to reveal themselves in the rays of light that flooded the room. Silhouettes of golden armor, of plumed helmets, of double-axe shields. They were there, again. One by one, the figures stepped out of the shadows and appeared under the archways that led into the hall. They were the silhouettes of warriors. They had the stance of warriors. They advanced in the formation of warriors. They carried the armor and weapons of warriors. Still, nothing but their numbers should have troubled Alwen. Unless the metal was dented and battered, betraying the withered passage of time and the scarring from 100 battles. Between their plates were telltale signs of past war wounds, slashes that had once pierced the steel and torn the flesh within. They bore the unmistakable mark of the elves. Though decayed and shrouded in a gloomy atmosphere, these carcasses still conveyed an aura of greatness and pride, just as the ancient battle armor and those they adorned had done in the past. Nothing should have worried Alwen but their numbers. Surely there was nothing to fear from those shattered warriors who stared at him from their closed helmets. Nothing but the knowledge that they had been dead and extinct since before history itself. There they were again, once more. Perhaps now they wanted to finish what they had started on the bridge. They did not move. They neither advanced nor retreated. They did not raise or lower the guard of their spears and swords, nor did they draw or release the arrows fitted to their bows. They just seemed to look at him with the same impassivity that only the dead can achieve, with the coldness and slowness of those for whom time means nothing. Alwen brandished the blade of his sword, ready to fight. His green eyes stared menacingly at his opponents. It is said that there is always a final battle for a warrior, and this warrior considered each of his battles to be the last. He wanted to warn his opponents that he had no intention of making their task any easier. They did not know him, of course. Ghosts or not, he was determined to fight to the very end. With resolve in his heart, he stood resolutely before them, his terrible and beautiful sword clenched in his fist. You could see the determination in his face. Alwen did not know if his impertinent boldness stopped the ghostly warriors, but just as on the wooden bridge, they did not come any closer. They stood still, intimidating him with their glowing pupils as before. Alwen raised his weapon. The walking relics responded in unison, raising their weapons and adopting a battle stance. Breathing became heavy. With his sword raised, the half-dwarf could not bring himself to swing it. With such a numerical disadvantage, the first mistake could turn the tide of battle against even the most skilled of warriors. He had too much time to think, and that worked against him. Alwen was a fiery warrior who thrived on the recklessness of battle. He had a suicidal streak that could tip the balance in any conflict, but given time to think, he would eventually weigh his options, which were usually few and far between. He began to retreat slowly. Just then, his boot hit a tile behind him. The decrepit elven soldiers moved as one and advanced on him without delay. His veteran mind tried to calculate his chances of success. Maybe there were too many of them. The elf paused again to steady his position. To his surprise, the ghostly squad of custodians stopped as well. Alwen studied them with a hard, piercing mask of concentration. He became aware of the frantic pounding of his heart. The winged helmets, the opulence of the feathers, and the threadbare clothing alone demanded respect. Slowly he retreated. Just as he had suspected, no sooner had he stepped back than the ghostly Sharik warriors advanced towards him again, expressionless, impassive, piercing him with their burning pupils. Alwen continued to retreat as his supposed enemies began to form a single compact block before him. With great skill and agility, we switched the aerial deftly from one hand to the other. This time, he was not trying to intimidate his opponents, as he was wont to do, by displaying his speed and skill with the lady. No. This time he was looking for an opening. He had to try. He always had been insolent. A furious scream ripped from Alwen's throat, reddening as if a river of red-hot metal had flowed down it. At the same time, the warrior made a savage thrust forward, the serrated jaws of his sword ready to rip through flesh. The veins in his neck swelled to bursting point. His eyes widened in fury, and he bared his teeth like a beast bearing down on its prey. The muscles in his legs propelled his body forward into the attack. They contracted and stretched with all their might. As his mouth opened in a shattering scream, his entire face was distorted from the effort and energy expended in the assault. At the same time, the aerial was already selecting its first target, losing all finesse as it turned into a base instrument of death. Alwen's eyes were fixed on the one who would be the first to feel the brutal impact of his blows. Ah! All of the dwarven rage that was stored in his muscles was unleashed with each blow. As so often before, it was the blood of the dwarven warrior that surged through his veins in those uncertain moments. The beautiful and deadly aerial ripped the void. The warrior closed his eyes for a split second as he thrust the mighty double-bladed sword towards its target. He expected to bury his steel deep, to feel the terrible blade of his sword tearing its way through his opponent, ripping and splitting his body. He was also prepared to feel the cold steel of the enemy tearing into his own flesh with an icy electric pain, followed by the warm touch of blood pouring from the open wound. There was neither. The metal of the aerial's jaws kissed the ground with a clatter, sending sparks flying from the glazed slab. He was so certain of striking an enemy that the sudden sensation of emptiness turned Alwen's fury against him, catapulting him straight onto the ground. He rolled, tumbling like a wooden doll across the polished surface of the stone. With a clatter, the aerial was separated from the hands of its owner. Unarmed, Alwen knew that what he did next would prove decisive. Something stirred in his mind, like stew in a cauldron. A strange sensation that he had no time to ponder. The half-dwarf's eyes found the sleeping silhouette of his weapon. His arm reached out as far as it would go with the intention of grabbing it. He hoped, even wished, that one of the enemy's ancient blades would pierce his body through his back. He would have been left there to rot and decay, skewered to the cold slab, becoming one with this accursed place shrouded in silence and mystery. But it was not so. None of that happened. Alwen managed to grab his weapon and stand up. He sprung up so quickly that he felt his head spin. He expected to find the cohort of custodians ready to attack him. He expected the bite of their steel, to see their fiery eyes behind the contours of their helmets. But he found nothing. The room was empty, quiet, deserted, as if no one had ever occupied the place. There was no sign of the ghostly warriors, their weapons or their pupils of fire. only silence. Deep, cold silence. The silence of relics. The silence of the dead. The silence of emptiness. Alwen's heart was the only thing moving in the old and abandoned room. Its bare and silent walls, the flood of light coming from the ceiling, the intertwined lovers. Everything was the same. Alwen felt as if his mind was playing games on him. He felt disorientated. He was not sure how much time had passed since he had entered the chamber. His face a ghostly shade of pale, Alwen ascended to the surface. Garin was surprised to see him and asked him what had happened. With a somber and energetic gesture, the blonde elf urged him to return to the shelter.
By all the gods of the Pantheon, Alwen. Where have you been? You did not think of going down there without me, did you?
We are leaving, Garin, that is all.
Alwen never confessed exactly what happened in those tunnels. Garin never even asked. When they arrived, they hurried to dismantle the camp and began to move. They had already wasted too much time there, the elves said. This unusual haste puzzled my friends, but none of them made a comment. The high peaks of Belgorod would be their next destination. They would ascend their steep slopes to get above the forest before taking a new route. As always, the only thing left to do was to follow them. The suns were slipping over the horizon, making contact with the edge of the world and turning the landscape a fiery brown. Claudia gazed out over the breathtaking panorama at their feet. As they climbed the flanks of the mountains and the forest plunged into the valley, the view before them cleared to present the travelers with an awe-inspiring canvas of nature's beauty. The wind blew hard, stirring their hair that flew free. The manes of the horses also moved to the rhythm of the breeze. Surrounded by the grandeur of the scene, the young woman paused for a few seconds to admire the sunset. A sunset that Dickie and I could no longer see. As she looked upon the tapestry of trees behind them, she could not keep her dark eyes from filling with tears. She was looking upon our final resting place. I heard again the same voices that had repeated themselves over and over in my dreams. As before, they faded away, replaced by others. I know I tried to open my eyes as much as I could, but all I remember of those hazy moments is a murky heaviness in my eyelids. My consciousness was weighed down by an intense and annoying feeling of intoxication. A constant, monotonous buzzing sound became deafening and dizzying in those moments of particular sensitivity. I couldn't be sure if it was coming from outside, or if the annoying sound was only in my mind, hammering at me from within. My poor vision was reduced to blurred patches of color. The pain in my eyes prevented me from pulling back my eyelids. It was as if they were made of lead. I could hear movement and the vague sound of voices, but I couldn't make out the words. I could only catch their echoes. I was barely aware of my reality. These memories come back to me, but I was uncertain whether I lived or imagined them. I wandered on the border between reality and delusion. Space and time had merged into a dense mist that was difficult to define. I think I was lying down, or perhaps sitting. I don't remember any sensation of touch. My skin registered no sense of my surroundings. I probably wouldn't have been able to distinguish a soft feather mattress from a blazing fire. Eyes. It was as if thousands of eyes were looking straight into my soul. That's how I felt. Watching. Studying. I think I spoke. At least I was left with the impression that something in my body, or My being had escaped the control of my will and acted on its own. I'm sure I said something, but I couldn't hear my voice. I wasn't even aware that my lips were moving. I don't know exactly how long it lasted. All that remains of that time are a few voices, those sensations that I have difficulty defining, and that heavy buzzing sound. A frenetic buzzing that clouded and covered everything. An annoying and constant buzzing, as if millions of insects were flying around inside my head. A feeling of uncontrolled dizziness. A desperate fall. Emptiness. Nothing else.